Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today I'll look at the topping E50 and L50 stack. This is a product that is an upgrade, if you like, from the E30 and L30, both of which were products that I absolutely loved, and so I was really excited when Apos Audio sent me out the E50 and the L50. So this is a review of a product coming from a channel affiliate in the form of Apos Audio. Any purchases you make using the links down below will provide some income back through to the channel, and for that I'm forever grateful. But as you'll see from the upcoming content I'm going to cover, not everything is rosy. The fact that there is affiliation involved doesn't change my views on these products. They've got some great features and a few things that I'm not 100% sold on. So I'll talk you through all of that in just a moment, but I did want to start off with saying a huge thanks to Apos for making this review possible. Because I am looking at two products at once, I'm going to keep things really simple for you in case you're only looking at one of them for yourself. And what I mean by that is I'm going to review the E50 first on its own, the L50 then by itself, and then talk about the two as a stack. So you can use the chapter markers either on the timeline down below here, or you can use the actual timestamps down in the description to jump to the pieces that you're interested in. Before I get into the individual pieces though, I do want to cover off one big gripe that I have with this entire stack because it applies to both products. And that is when you look at the back, you'll notice that for a balanced product, there is no sign of XLR connectors. And that's because Topping are choosing to use 6.3mm TRS connectors. So in other words, it's the same connector as is normally used on a headphone cable, the normal 6.3mm with 3 different contacts, tip, ring and sleeve. That's being used to carry the 3 signals or the 3 connections that would be in a 3-pin XLR. Now I believe in some of Topping's other products that are using this approach, they're providing in the box a 6.3 to XLR adapter. But in neither the E50 or the L50 box did I receive such an adapter. And in looking at the manuals, there is no mention of there having meant to be such an adapter within these devices, so it appears that it's just not provided. And that for me is a really big problem. Topping have chosen to use connections that are not commonly available. And so most people that buy this stack will then have to go out and spend extra money on cables. They're not too hard to find. I was able to pick up a pair on Amazon for a relatively affordable price, but the problem was I then had to wait for that to be delivered. I then don't know if it's a good quality cable or not because there are very few choices to compare. So there's a few big issues that I have with that. I'll talk shortly about whether or not that's a deal breaker in terms of whether you absolutely have to have balanced connection or if the RCA single-ended connection is just as good. But I did want to raise that I think that's pretty bad form on Topping's part to use an unusual connector and not provide some kind of solution, ideally in both of these boxes. I think there should have been the 6.3 to female connector in one box, and I can't remember off the top of my head which one uses which in terms of the DAC output versus the amp input. But my point is, each of these products should have had the appropriate 6.3 to XLR connector so that you could use your existing XLR balanced cables for both of these devices. So do keep that in mind as we go through. I'm not going to harp on it for each of the individual products, but it's something I wanted you to know. For now though, let's set the scene of what we're looking at here. The E50 DAC is a $269 balanced DAC using a Saber chip. I'll go into more detail in a moment. And the L50 amp is a balanced headphone amp that retails for $229. So you're coming in for this stack just shy of $500. and that means just a little bit less than 700 Australian dollars. As I said before, I'll cover off the stack comparison in a little while, but let's start off with a look at the beginning of your source chain in the E50. Now there's not a huge amount to talk about on the front of this device, it's very, very simple. You've got a beautiful orange display screen hidden under the black shiny glass here, and then on the end we've got a touch sensitive power and source selector switch. So long press will switch the device on and off, and a short press will cycle through USB, optical or coaxial. Other than that, all other controls are handled through the remote control, and it's the same topping remote control that you've seen 1,000 times. Nothing wrong with that, it's a perfectly functional remote control. Moving around to the back of the device, we've got a 5V DC input, and that means that this DAC, like many of Topping's DACs, comes with a USB to DC barrel connector. And the idea is that you drive it straight from either your USB power socket or from an external power source such as a phone charger or a battery pack of some sort. When we get to the sound quality section, I'll talk about how big of a difference it makes running it from USB versus running it from a cleaner, better power source. Moving along the back though, we've also got USB-B input, optical input and coaxial input, as you would have already gathered. And then we've got a RCA output for single-ended output, and also these balanced outputs that I spoke about before. So a pair of 6.3mm TRS tip ring sleeve connectors. Other than that, there's really nothing to know about the E50. From an interface point of view, like a physical interactivity point of view, there's really not much to it. On the inside of the DAC, there is a lot more going on though. We've got a new ESS 9068AS chip, which is a very recent model from ESS and offers things like onboard MQA decoding. In addition to that, the E50 can now decode MQA from USB, but then also from optical and coaxial connections. Now whether MQA is something you want to use, that's entirely up to you, but it's nice to know that the functionality is now there from multiple inputs. Beyond that, the only other major features to talk about with the E50 are that it does have switchable outputs, which is becoming a common theme on Topping products and is fantastic, and it's easily switched using the remote control line out button to jump between single-ended only, balanced only, or both. So great if you're running, say, active speakers on one hand and a headphone amp on the other, and you want to be able to switch one off and the other one on at your leisure. That then also alludes to the fact that there is volume control capability or preamp capability within the E50, so you can suddenly see it's a very full-featured DAC. The final feature available are the filters, of which there are only 3, but all 3 are very good. I'd be pretty happy with all of them, and I've probably landed on F1 filter 1 being my preferred sound. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about sound quality. The sound from the E50 is absolutely phenomenal for a DAC at this price. The detail retrieval and resolution is above what I would ever expect from a DAC at this price point, and I'll provide some comparisons soon so you can hear exactly what I mean. The tonality comes across very neutral with no emphasis anywhere, but when I say neutral, I truly mean neutral, so it's not delving into analytical territory where it's cold and it's sterile, but nor is it warm or thick, it's just a really nice middle of the road. And to go along with that, there's a nice, well-sized soundstage with very good imaging separation. As usual, being a Delta Sigma chip, it doesn't produce a great deal of depth, but as far as the width of the soundstage and the imaging focus, the E50 is extremely good for the price. And all of the comments I've made so far are based on using it with the USB power coming from my laptop in most cases, running straight into the DC socket. So in other words, that's the E50 running in its most handicapped state. The power from USB sockets is notoriously dirty, and that will affect the performance of the E50. To put that to the test, I ran it off a battery power pack, like a backup charging block. I ran the USB from that into the E50, and I listened to Fire and Rain by James Taylor. With the battery power connected, the already excellent sound became even more open, more spacious, but retained all of the other positive characteristics, of course. The guitar work became smoother, but at the same time, the picking of each string became crisper and more cleanly defined. And overall, the guitar was now better separated in the mix as well. When the snare entered the mix, it was a bit less gritty now without the noise coming from the USB power supply, but at the same time, it was crisp and snappy still. So what you're getting is just any of the hash, the noise, anything getting in the way is stripped away, and the end result is a much cleaner, much more detailed sound with an even better sense of space. In short, if you're thinking about buying an E50, make sure you do use either a decent quality phone charger, and in the past I've reviewed the Topping P50 linear power supply, which is also a great choice. In the Topping P50 review, I looked at a few different chargers, and different chargers may give you different results. So you might want to play with a couple that you've got lying around and see which sounds best. Or in my experience, the very best choice is to grab yourself a battery power pack. DACs like this don't draw much current, and so a battery power pack that's designed for any decent amount of volume, so in other words enough to provide power a couple of times over for a mobile phone, those will have plenty of juice to give you lots and lots of listening time on the E50 and will give you the best possible sound quality. So do invest in that along with the E50, it's absolutely worth it. Before I move on to some comparisons, I just want to mention that I did try the coaxial, optical and USB inputs to see if there were any significant differences between them, and I didn't find anything significant. There were different cables for each, and they are different interfaces, so the sound was slightly variable across all of them, but I would gladly listen to all of them. It wasn't like there was a huge drop-off on any of them, and therefore I would say they're performing basically equivalently. Normally with DACs like this, I like to compare the balanced and the RCA output, but on this occasion I can't do that because I can't match the same cables for both the balanced and the RCA because of that 6.3mm TRS connection. So I apologise, I can't tell you if they're exactly the same, but what I can tell you is that both the RCA and the balanced TRS sound fantastic. So I'd have no problems using this as a balanced DAC or a single-ended DAC. And so with all that out of the way, let me give you a quick comparison of another DAC in the similar price range to the E50. And this is a DAC that I love in the Geshelli J2. The J2 costs about $30 more at $299 USD, and it does come with proper XLR outputs. So for some people, that's going to be enough of a reason to immediately go for the J2. The J2 also offers more input connections. And instead of having the variable volume control that is a linear volume control where you can step up and down, the J2 instead jumps from gain levels, so there's full output, I think there's like 1/3 reduced, and then it's half output or something similar. The key point being it jumps in significant steps versus the volume control that's in the E50. When comparing these two, I listened to Rule the World by Michael Kiwanuka. On that track, the E50 clearly came across as the more resolving DAC. The vocals were more textured, more nuanced, and there was a better overall sense of space. When the strings kicked in, there was a better sense of separation from the vocals, and also overall a better sense of texture in the sound. So hands down for me, the E50 is the better DAC when compared to the J2. And as I said before, I'm a huge fan of the Geshelli J2. I still have it in my collection. I still intend to keep it in my collection, but I'll also very comfortably say the E50 is the better DAC. One final point that I noticed as well with the E50, listening to Rule the World, was that the E50 had a better sense of control over the bass. Both were great, both were fine, but I felt like everything was just a little bit tighter and punchier and snappier coming from the E50 in terms of bass. Having been really impressed by the E50 at this point, I thought I'd put it up against a much harder competition in the Burson Audio Composer. I'm not going to go through full description of everything I heard, but suffice to say, the Composer was now significantly better than the E50 in all of the same ways that I just described the E50 compared to the J2. So now instead of the E50 being better than the J2, now it was that the Composer was better than the E50. So you can do better than this. This isn't the best DAC in the world, but for the price, it's absolutely fantastic. And with that said, let's now move on to talking about the L50. So the L50 here is the companion amplifier. It's a fully balanced amp, but of course you can buy them separately. As I mentioned before, it's a $229 US amplifier, which equates to around about 300 Australian dollars. It offers a pretty huge 2.8 watts at 32 ohms, according to Topping, and all that you really need to know from that is it's going to have the power you need to drive any headphone or IEM potentially that you could ever want it to. Speaking of IEMs, before I get into the sound quality, I do want to mention that I tried IEMs on this and it works just fine. There's a little bit of sound leakage at the very lowest 0 volume setting, but that's not really a problem, and there's no sense of hiss. There is though a reasonable amount of volume range available for listening to sensitive IEMs. So that's great. This can power everything from your sensitive IEMs all the way through to the most power hungry headphones. You will find a bit of channel imbalance between the 0, or in this case it's about the 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock positions. There's a bit of channel imbalance. And then I did find that usable range often kicked in for things that are more sensitive up in around the 9 to 9:30 mark. So there's not a huge amount of usable volume, but I do think there's enough. And part of that comes from, and sorry if I've done this the wrong way around, part of that comes from the fact that we've got 3 gain levels. So the L50 here has low, medium, and high gain. So that's really great. It gives it lots of versatility, and it does allow you to use any sort of earphone or headphone. On the front, while we're talking about it, I should also mention that we've got a 3-way switch for the power as well, but on this occasion, it's not preamp or headphone amp. It's to go from the off position to balanced or single-ended inputs. So you tell it with the power switch whether you're using the RCA inputs or the balanced TRS inputs. And speaking of those, let's have a look now at the back. On the back of this amp, we've got a 15 volt AC input, so it is an AC wall wart and therefore not an amp you're going to be running off a linear power supply. From there, we've got a pair of balanced and a pair of RCA single-ended outputs, which are a pass-through only. So this isn't a preamp, it is only an amplifier for your headphones. But what it will do, which can be quite handy, is pass through the signal that's coming into the balanced RCAs. It will pass that directly out of the pass-through RCAs. And likewise, for the balanced connections, it'll pass that same signal out the balanced outputs. So you can daisy chain this amp, but it doesn't provide any kind of volume control or signal modification. It's just a simple pass-through. And so with all that said, let's talk a bit about how the L50 sounds. And for me, this is where things aren't quite as rosy as it was with the E50. The L50 for me is a really solid headphone amplifier, but it's not the best thing I've heard around the price and in terms of the general design. There's an amplifier that I listen to that I don't necessarily want to name right now, just in case there's any delays in launch. But it's been sent to me for listening to a prototype, and I will have the finished version here for review soon, and it's priced in the similar ballpark to the L50. In listening to the L50 alongside this other comparable amp, both in terms of specs and functionality and also pricing, what I found was that the L50 comes across just a bit grainy, not as clean as I'd like, and also not as spacious sounding as I'd like. It's a nice step up from something like, say, an L30. It's still very, very good, and if you recall, if you've regularly watched the channel, you'll know that I raved about the L30. But since then, I've come across other products that are more advanced, do things a bit differently, that manage to go further and outperform the L30. And the L50 doesn't really break the mold from the L30, it's more of a continuation. Whereas I feel like some other brands and some other products have stepped beyond what the L30 and L50 are doing. So again, the L50 is not a terrible amp, and if you want a nice clean stack, this makes a great combination, as I'll talk about soon. But if you're just looking at the L50, do stay tuned, make sure you subscribe, because I've got an absolutely killer balanced amp coming up soon. For now though, I'm going to give you a bit of a comparison listening to the L50 and this other, and I apologise for this, but currently unnamed amp. Listening to that particular combination of amps with the track Raining in Baltimore by Counting Crows, what I heard was some of what I've already described to you. It was a bit grainier, there was a slightly lesser sense of space from the L50 compared to this other comparable amp. Things were generally not as enjoyable. They were still fine, but not as enjoyable from the L50. The thing that probably stood out to me the most was that the piano coming through in this track, when I was listening to the L50, sounded a bit kind of compressed or muted or something. It was like the natural harmonic richness of the piano was somehow being subdued. The other amp didn't do that. The other amp allowed it to really have its sense of weight and body and richness in the piano, whereas the L50 felt a bit artificial. Again, it's not a big deal and not a reason not to buy the L50, but if you're just looking for an amp, I do potentially think you can do a bit better. And so at this point, just to summarise, the E50 is a hands down winner for me as a DAC. The L50 is an okay amp, but an amp that I would probably recommend only if you're looking for the aesthetic appeal of having these two stacked on your desk. I think they're a great looking stack, functionally they're very good, and so as a combined package, I do think it still makes sense. It's not a reason to not buy the package just because of the amp. I think the E50 is so good that it does lift the amp when combined as a stack, and it makes them a really good pairing. But to put that into context, let's talk about a couple of very specific stacks. And I'm going to start with an unnamed stack because it includes the unnamed amplifier, but both stacks are priced roughly the same amount. Both stacks provide fairly similar specs and features, and so they are fairly comparable. And what I heard as I listened to both, even though the amplifier in the unnamed stack is better than the amplifier here, what I heard was that the combination of the amazing E50 with the slightly less amazing L50 was an absolute match for the other stack where the amplifier was really strong, but the DAC to me was maybe not quite as good. So it balanced itself out. And that's why I say I don't think you should worry about buying the topping 50 stack as it is, because the E50 lifts the L50. When comparing that other brand stack, what I felt in the end was that I would buy them based on the price at the time, the aesthetic of both, which one you prefer, and ultimately which feature set you prefer, because there's minor differences between them. By no means would I recommend against the 50 stack when you are buying it as a stack. This stack is just too good to pass up, and therefore if you like the look of the 50 stack, then buy the 50 stack. The other stack that I thought was relevant and useful to compare here was the SMSL SH8S and SU8S that I've reviewed recently here on the channel. Once again, fairly similarly priced, slightly different functionality in the sense that you've got XLR from the SU8 and the SH8. Then also the fact that you've got some extra features and functions on the SU8S DAC, but beyond that they are pretty similar stacks. When comparing the two stacks, I was listening to Elijah Rock by Harry Connick Jr. And what I found was that the topping stack gave me a greater sense of space in the listening experience, and it was smoother and easier to listen to across the board. It didn't lack any detail or resolution, it just provided everything in a smoother, easier way. I felt like tonally the SMSL stack emphasised the treble just a little bit, and I don't mean in terms of frequency response, but just the character of the sound. The treble's a little bit drier, a little bit crisper, as opposed to it actually being boosted in any way. It's just got a slightly different presentation. And that can lead to a perception of increased clarity, and so some people may prefer it for that reason. Personally, I would choose the 50 stack because I find that more relaxed presentation, and I don't mean relaxed in a bad, sloppy, unrefined way, but I mean that smoothness that makes the music easier to listen to, in the long run actually allows you to hear more of the details hidden throughout the whole frequency range, rather than just what's tucked away in the treble. I do think both stacks are excellent, and I'd personally probably choose the topping stack based entirely on its looks and its form factor. Functionality wise, I do think the SMSL stack is better because it does have XLR outputs and inputs, and it's also got a few more bits and pieces going on in the menu system of the SU8S. So again, I don't mean to sit on the fence with this one, but between all three stacks that I've looked at, including the 50 stack, it's hard to go wrong with any of them, and that's kind of cool because you've got lots of choices. That said, I think the 50 stack looks sleek, it performs really well, it's got excellent range of compatibility with the 3-step gain control on the L50, it's just all in all a really solid stack. I do really wish they hadn't gone down the path of the TRS connectors for balanced, but again they couldn't have kept it such a compact and attractive looking stack if they'd gone down the path of XLR. That immediately would have taken up, if you think about it, like a single XLR would take up as much space as the pair of TRS connectors. So I get it, I understand, but I wish that included the XLR adapters within the box for both the E50 and the L50. So to bring this all to a conclusion, if you're here just for a DAC, the E50 should absolutely be on the top of your list for anything under probably about $500 US. It's absolutely stellar. And again, I can't compare it to every single DAC under the sun. If I haven't covered it on the channel, I probably haven't heard it yet. So there might be better things out there for the money, but I haven't heard them yet and can't comment. What I can tell you is that of everything I've heard so far, this is clearly and easily the best DAC I've heard up to and at $269 US and maybe a bit beyond it. On the amp side of things, maybe not so much. It's a good solid amp, but not one that I would rush out to buy on its own when there are other excellent options around and another brand new one coming very, very soon to market. So remember, stay tuned, hit the subscribe button if you want to know what that one is. And so if you're interested in either or both of these, do think about using the link below through to Appos Audio if you're in North America to say thank you to them for making this review possible. If you're outside of North America, I'll have a look around and see if I can pop some other links down below as well. If you found this review useful, as always, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like. It helps the channel more than you can ever imagine. And then beyond that, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound. Bye.